Yeah, so today we have a law professor from the US come across for a few different reasons, but he's here today to talk to us about the topic of, as you obviously know, lawyers as moral leaders. So this is Dr. Terry Halliday, so if you'd like to give him a warm welcome, that would be great. Would you like to introduce yourself by anything, or I can just let you get started?
I'm glad to introduce myself. I'm at a research institute in Chicago, which is an institute of advanced studies, an interdisciplinary place where we do research of some kind or other on law, and we're all either social scientists, I'm a sociologist, or academic lawyers. And actually I'm going to talk to you about one line of research that we've been working on. I've been working on with a group of scholars, about 30 scholars across the world for the last 25 years, can you believe? And I'll summarize some parts of that research as it relates to law and religion, political change, and then think a little bit more about it from a Christian point of view towards the end. Great to be here and great to be back in Melbourne. Haven't been for a few years, but I have an appointment at the Australian National University, so at least I'm in Australia to polish up my accent once a year for a time. So we've got a limited amount of time, and so I'll move through these some of these slides pretty quickly and concentrate on some other ones in a little bit more depth. But I want to start by talking a bit about this man here, Baiguang, who you can see with President Bush. Just a few days ago, this man, whom I know well, because I've been doing research on China for many years, just a few days he was in the US giving a briefing to the Congressional Executive Commission on China. He went back to China, he felt a bit sick, he went into a hospital, and hours later he was dead. Given that he is one of China's leading human rights lawyers, and given that he is also a Christian, this raised a lot of suspicion for reasons that I'll come to a little bit later because of the way in which a crackdown in China against rights activists and Christians has gone on since the middle of 2015. But actually the story of Baiguang and activism relates to three sets of work that I've been doing over many years. A number of years ago, Linda Haller here at the Melbourne Law School and I organized a conference, or part of a conference in Stanford. It was an international conference on legal ethics. And we raised the question for lawyers and for law professors, what does it mean to be a moral or an ethical or an heroic lawyer? The second set of conjunctions is that, as I mentioned, I've been working with political scientists and historians, legal scholars, sociologists since the mid-1990s on trying to understand across history, since the 17th century and across the world, under what conditions do you get transitions from illiberal political societies, authoritarian regimes, military dictatorships, totalitarian regimes, to liberal political societies. And what kind of roles do lawyers, law professors, judges, other people with legal training play in these kinds of transitions? So I'm going to talk mostly about that today. And then the third set of questions became for me, almost by accident, I have to say, a set of research questions. So I'm interested in social and political change. And when I started research on the second set of problems, I was working, my two collaborators were both Jewish. One is a French intellectual based in Paris. Another is a law professor at Berkeley. None of us thought about religion at all. But in the process of our research, we saw religion appear. And then, of course, I became particularly interested in Christians, and when you're working on China, Protestant Christians. And so today I'm going to talk about the interplay of these three things. So somebody we brought together a bunch of eminent philosophers and legal scholars at the conference at Stanford. And one of those scholars from Georgetown University was thinking about the morality of lawyers, and he was playing with this idea of what is an heroic lawyer. And actually, I'm going to use heroic in our discussion for a few minutes as a shorthand for a moral lawyer, somebody who's actually going beyond doing ordinary legal work and thinks of themselves as contributing in some kind of moral or normative way to a better society, which is also a calling for all Christians. And this professor had a very interesting take on three different kinds of heroism. which I think actually is something we can think of more broadly than for lawyers. He had what he called a thin conception. So anybody, he said, who just goes a little bit further than doing their everyday work, puts in a little bit more effort, takes a little bit less money, maybe takes on a lost cause, you could think of as sort of somebody who's rather heroic in their calling. A thicker conception of heroism, David Luban said, is somebody who takes on something bigger and stronger than he is, or she is, on behalf of the forces of good and shows extraordinary tenacity. So this is somebody who has a cause and who hangs in for this cause year after year, decade after decade, even though there may not be much apparent progress. And the final conception is a kind of a David and Goliath conception, what he called the mono myth of the heroic. This is somebody who wades into battle. He's in a world, or she's in a world of fabulous forces, completely beyond the capacity of any one person to take on. And this person wages the battle, and then they come back to tell the story. So essentially it is like David against the entire Philistine army and Goliath. And so there are in the modern history of lawyers and earlier on, but in the contemporary history of Chinese lawyers, these kinds of heroic figures like Baiguang, who over 20, 30 years has been fighting. He's been disappeared, he's been tortured, his family has been persecuted, but he's just one of those tenacious people who keeps going. So in the project that I've been involved in, a series of books in the last 10 or 15 years, we've been looking at the way in which lawyers and religion plays a role in shifting countries towards a democratic or a constitutional or an open political society. In particular, we've been talking about ideals that people share for fighting for these three kinds of things together. And these are debates, I might say, that are relevant in Australia, they're relevant in the US, they are relevant in the UK at the present time, because it's not only a matter of fighting for these things, almost always in any country they need to be defended in order to be robust. So lawyers will fight for sort of core civil rights. That is to say, they frequently will fight against arbitrary arrest, people being yanked from their beds in the middle of the night, tortured, put to death without any kind of legal protection. Almost all lawyers everywhere will agree that's a bad thing and will try and do something about it. Frequently, they'll also fight for core political rights. So they want people to be able to express themselves openly, to worship freely, whatever is their religion, and actually to get together, to share common interests as we are today, a kind of freedom of association. And also, lawyers frequently will fight for property rights. In order for all those things to happen, you need a civil society. That is to say, some kind of organization outside the state, voluntary associations and so on, which is part of, in a sense, of the genius of liberal politics. So these are organizations that are not controlled by the state. They're organizations that are always strongly disliked by dictators, authoritarian rulers, because they potentially challenge their rule. And the final and extremely important point is this idea of the moderate state. Because power and the concentration of power is dangerous, goes the argument, somehow or other you need to have the power of government fractured, broken up. So the parts of government are locked in some kind of tension with other parts of government. We see this in Montesquieu and in Tocqueville. In the US, we think about it in terms of the separation of powers. You have it, of course, in Australia with the role of the High Court and such like. So, lawyers trying to defend these kinds of values as heroic figures pay a price for this. And so our research demonstrates over the years, and my latest book on China, which, by the way, I'm talking about tonight at 5:30 at the law school, for those of you who are interested, lawyers pay an economic price. They often work for little or no money. In China, they can be, they have their licenses suspended, or they're no longer able to practice. People are ostracized, humiliated by the government. Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore humiliated the president of the National Law Society when the Law Society held him to account. And in some parts of the world, as we document in our China book, and as Li Baiguang demonstrates, people are not only physically beaten up, they may be tortured, and there's always the ultimate risk of sacrificing one's life. So, I don't really have time to talk about all these various kinds of ways that lawyers mobilize. Let me give you sort of one sentence on each. Reserve infrastructures are where organizations like the monastery in Catalonia in Spain during Franco's dictatorship became a sort of a retreat, a protected space where judges got together to organize. The security apparatus wouldn't go into the monastery, so the monastery became kind of a reserved space. Protected spaces are a bit like sanctuaries in the Old Testament. During the military dictatorship in Chile in the 1980s, 70s and 80s, the cardinal in the main cathedral in Santiago said that people who are being persecuted by the state could have protection there, and the church would protect them from the security apparatus. We see the same thing in Kenya with the Anglican Church during Moi's big man rule in the 1970s and 80s. Sometimes activists will monitor abuses. This is actually a very effective way of signaling to rulers that they're going to be held accountable. And it is something that's used today by Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch, with which I'm associated, where a civil society or a human rights organization tells rulers that we're watching you, and they do it by keeping a systematic record of every kind of abuse, every disappearance, every case of torture, every case of arbitrary arrest, with as many details as possible. So in Hong Kong, there's a human rights group that has a massive spreadsheet. Amnesty International keeps it, so that every lawyer from the mainland who is in any way persecuted, disappeared, tortured, a record is made of exactly where they were when they were taken, when they were taken, where they were taken, what the kind of legal representation they've had is. And so at any moment in time, you can get a snapshot of what's been happening to these people. And what it has the effect of doing, because often the names of the security apparatus people are actually mentioned, or the chief of the local bureau, what it does is constantly signal to persecutors, we have your name, we know what you did, we have a record of it, and one day you may be held accountable, as was indeed the case in Chile once the military dictatorship was over there. In Brazil, one of the scholars, a political scientist who worked with us on one of our books, talked about the ways in which the rights consciousness of Brazilians in general was raised by a Catholic group who demonstrated how much police abuse there was. One of the interesting discoveries we have had in our research is that sometimes you get religious organizations who are supporting lawyers in these protection of rights, but frequently religious groups don't. So some of the church hierarchy in Pinochet's Chile actually supported the dictatorship. Very frequently, the church just washes its hands and says we're not going to have anything to do. We're not going to comment on politics. We're not going to comment on the brutality that's going on. It's not just the church, of course. We see this with Buddhist leaders in Sri Lanka. We actually see Buddhist leaders in Myanmar right now actually leading part of the repression against the Muslims. We see it in Sri Lanka with Hindu leaders who were compliant with the brutality of the Tamil Tigers. One of our one of our essayists in a book talks about the way in which Israeli lawyers, who are often very strong on all sorts of issues and came out against the government on this issue and that issue and some other issue, when it came to Palestinians and the treatment of Palestinians, they all went silent. And then sometimes we see in the United States, for example, after 9/11, we see it with Trump's administration, religious groups kind of divide in the middle. So some religious people are very strongly for repression, other people are resisting it. I'm going to talk for a few minutes about the Chinese lawyers that I've been studying for the last 20 years. So I got involved I was doing some research many years ago on the politics of legal professions. And in a 5-year plan that was instituted in the early 2000s, the Premier of China brought together some specialists from around the world, including someone from Australia, to try and give some advice to the Chinese government on regulating professions going forward. And that was my first exposure to doing work with China. I then did some work on commercial legal change in China. But then from about 2005, I've been studying the role of Chinese lawyers in fighting for basic legal freedoms in China. We've seen it in France in the 18th century. We've seen it in Chile, as I've mentioned. We've seen it in Africa. Across the world, we can see these struggles. And so our question was, has it gone on also in China? When we proposed this research to the National Science Foundation in the US, we never mentioned religion, I have to say. I feel not too good about that. You would think that as a Christian, that would have been something, obviously, I would have built into my theory, but I didn't. But one day, a law professor said to me in Hong Kong, do you know that a disproportionate number of China's leading rights lawyers are Christians? I said, no, I didn't know that. He said, yes. He said, probably about 40% of China's rights lawyers are Christians. And he said, I know many of these people. I don't know quite why they do it. And so I suddenly saw a great sub-research project there. So I said to my translator in Beijing, do you know about this? Oh, yes, she said, my former boyfriend is one of the leading ones. Would you like to meet him? So she took me out to lunch with her former boyfriend. We had a great discussion. He said, look, I'm just going off to a meeting with some other rights lawyers. Would you like to come with me? I said, sure. So off we went. And we went into a Chinese restaurant and in an upper room, in a closed room around a huge round table. There were about a dozen lawyers, and they all went round and introduced themselves. And then the last person, the most senior of them, then said to me, you have now met most of the lawyers on China's blacklist of people who are in trouble with the security apparatus. So from then on, I tried to do some research on what is the theology, what is the thinking of these Christian lawyers on the one side, and how does it link up with their jurisprudence or their ideas about law on the other side. And these are some of the kinds of interesting logics that emerge from that research. And one of the most commonly stated parts of our research, responses to our research, was this notion that there is a fundamental equality of all persons in Christianity because everybody is a sinner. And one way that has an impact on the mind of Chinese, as said so many people, is that it brings Chairman Mao down to the same level as me. I'm a sinner, but he's a sinner. And then when you go to the next step, if indeed we're all sinners, one of the expressions of sin can be an effort to concentrate power, as we saw with Mao Zedong and we see with many political leaders. Donald Trump would love to have much more power. And so this is a fundamental problem of all political leaders. And so these lawyers said, well, if it really is the case that concentration of power is dangerous, that we really are sinners, we need some kind of a legal system to fracture power. And so that then ends up being some kind of checks and balances in the politics of a country. And so these lawyers moved from their theology fairly quickly into a notion about what Chinese political institutions should be like. But you can see that final point is very similar to this fighting for the moderate state that we've seen across the world in the last 2 or 3 centuries. So then I had difficulty in my research in trying to extract from these people's heads what was their theology. And I tried all sorts of various ways. And one way was to ask them what are big Christian concepts that they think are important. that inform why they're rights lawyers. And so obviously justice was one of them, and they frequently quoted from Amos. Interestingly enough, they frequently quoted Martin Luther King to me as one of their great heroes. They, of course, we've just talked about equality. They talk time and time again about the concept of being made in the image of God, human dignity, from the first chapters of Genesis. This is a very dangerous concept, the concept of freedom in Chinese thought. And this is why, in a way, these lawyers are dangerous to a regime. Chinese people think rights come from the government. Christians know that actually rights are given by God. You get into a conflict between those two, and which prevail, the voice of God. And so this makes them actually potentially dangerous to any kind of regime that wants to claim a monopoly over power and a monopoly over the notion that it's the government that gives freedom and not God. And of course, for Christians, religion, not just for Christians, Muslims, Tibetan Buddhists, religious freedom is incredibly important. Actually, for a sociologist or political scientist, it's also important because many of the Chinese activists who are not Christians will argue for the importance of religious freedoms, not so much because of the religion, but just because it's another expression of being able to speak your own views, your own point of view, without having the government tell you what you can think or what you cannot think. We talked a little bit about those two. So let me just finish with this comment about lawyers as moral leaders, but then widen the point. So frequently in the scholarship that I've been involved with over the years and in law schools, people think about lawyers and work, lawyers and markets. And what our project over the years has tried to show is that lawyers sometimes are, or most often are, acting as sort of economic actors. But frequently they will work solely or sometimes together in a kind of a political role in order to try and produce a good political society. And sometimes the possibility of that good political society coming about depends on their alliances with religious groups and religious leaders. We see this in a number of countries. For example, during the Brazilian military dictatorship in the 1970s and the 1980s, it was said that the only two organizations left standing that were not completely and directly controlled by the military was the Brazilian Bar Association and the Roman Catholic Church. Or another example, in Zambia, the president decided after 2 terms that it would be very nice if he just kind of keep on going, the so-called big man regime that we saw in many African countries. And this set up a tremendous fight inside Zambia to stop him changing the constitution to get more than 2 terms. It was led by the Zambian Law Society. But the 2 groups that actually made that leadership consequential were women's groups whose connections went out to the very edges of a society, and Christian denominations, the Anglicans and the Presbyterians and others, the Roman Catholics, who came together and said no. And so that coalition actually changed the nature of Zambian society. So when I'm talking to lawyers in legal professions, I say that we need to have a concept of being a legal profession that's more than earning a living or more than just defending this particular person, which may be very important in its own right, so I'm not criticizing that. But there is a much wider vision that lawyers can have. But I would say the same point when I'm talking to Christians of any disciplinary background, that part of the rampage of individualism that has grown up in so many societies over the last 2 or 3 centuries, we're so focused on ourselves as individuals and our individual relationship with God, our individual relationship with other individuals, that we forget that we are called as Christians to a much bigger calling. It's the call of the minor prophets, it's the call of Martin Luther King, it's the call of Baiguang, that we need to care about the nature of Australian society, or the nature of US society. We need to care about whether it's treating the poorest and the weakest of the people honorably, as Amos said to Israelite society. And I think we also need to care about its politics. So we need to be constantly vigilant to make sure that our political apparatus, that our political way of organizing everyday life is carefully monitored to be sure that power is balanced, that all voices can be openly heard, and that we have a truly open society in which not only faith can flourish, faith of any kind, but in which we can be free. So with that, I'm open to any comments, questions, thoughts. Yes?
So my question is about moral leadership versus legal, like as lawyers, legal ethical obligations.
Yes.
So how the heroic lawyer, I suppose, mediate or balance those two things? Because often your ethical considerations as a lawyer are opposed to your moral considerations. For instance, if you're representing a client that perhaps you don't agree with morally, but your ethical obligations to your legal system, to due process and rule of law would require you to do something that perhaps you're not morally for.
Yeah. And so I think those two things have to be held in tension. I'm not an expert on individual legal ethics, but I think one of the great weaknesses of legal ethics in most common and civil law countries is that they've just become focused on particular lawyer-client relationships. In a sense, I'm talking about a social ethics here that is a call to the entire profession, to the Victorian Bar, to the Australian Bar Association, or I forget the name of it now, which I studied many years ago, or the American Bar Association, where the entire collective import and power of the profession is brought to bear on the government and can actually, or is brought to bear on shaping public consciousness. And there, I think we move away from the ethical issues that you rightly point to, but also to a whole lot of bigger issues. So what we were trying to do at this conference in Stanford was to push people's thinking about legal ethics from being individual ethics of defending or representing a client to a collective ethics about a good society and what that good society looks like.
There's, I think, quite a common conception that the role of the lawyer is to vigorously pursue their client's interests as an adversarial advocate, regardless of their own moral views on that point, and that fulfilling that role is providing a social good, that is access to the law. And because of that the lawyer is doing something moral, being a heroic lawyer just by fulfilling that role. I'm wondering if you have comments on that, and if you would go further to say that as a person striving to be a heroic lawyer as a Christian, whether you should refuse to take cases where the client may be pursuing an interest that goes against the public good, even though it may mean restricting that client's access to the law.
And actually, this is a very a question that many of these Christian activist lawyers face in China. One of the struggles they find is, do they only do what is best for this given client in this given circumstance? So it's absolutely focused on the interests of the client alone, in which case they may do a lot of good for the client, but only for the client. Or do they use the problem that the client has got involved in? Say the client has been arrested because they were part of a protest over environmental pollution, which is very common in China. Should the client be used as a kind of a springboard for making a much bigger moral point, and which may or may not be to the advantage of the client, actually, because the issue could be blown up in such a way that the government is retributive in its reactions to the client, and the Christian lawyers go different ways on that. Some Christian lawyers, I think Baiguang would say, you focus on what's good for the client. But other Christian lawyers that I've talked to say the contrary. They say, look, we're trying to make Chinese society a more just society. We're not just interested in law, we're interested in justice, and justice for the society as a whole. And so they may then approach the case in a different way, publicize it in ways that you wouldn't do if you were thinking only of the interests of the client, that deliver a bigger good. So that doesn't exactly answer your question, but it is a way in which the struggle is entered into when we're thinking about the society as a whole rather than a client in particular.
So you mentioned like Amnesty International or religious groups as active groups that are standing up for like the social good of society. What would you say the most effective ways are to actually make an impact for us? So if we say, okay, we would like to engage in these activities, what would be the place to start?
There are lots of opportunities. One way with human rights groups is to offer, say, to the local chapter of Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch here in Victoria or in Melbourne to see whether there is opportunity for volunteers to work together. Many human rights groups, including Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, are a bit uneasy about Christians and Christian groups. Because they've often seen them, the Christian groups are opposed to certain kinds of rights that some of these groups want to press for. So I'm in very close touch with the Human Rights Watch director for China, who's based in Washington. And it's quite clear in talking to her that knowing that I'm a Christian and I care about these Christian lawyers, we have a very good relationship, and we've worked together on lots of things. But still, it's just for her, it's a little bit awkward. I would actually like to see in the U.S. Many more Christian groups come out in support of people like Baiguang and making public statements which have a shaming effect on China, which China doesn't like. Or I'd like to see Christian groups, it could be Christian student groups, come out on behalf of making statements about somebody, or in defense of somebody who's been very badly wronged, that breaches our sense of justice, for example, or something we really care about, like freedom of speech or freedom of religion. Part of, I think, the difficulty that Protestantism in general has faced in many countries over the last several decades is that we've sort of gone inward. Sometimes in the US we've gone outward in the wrong way, in my view, and supported the wrong kind of policies, and that's another story. But I would like to see Christians, people like many of us, take seriously our role in society as a whole in trying to find some way that we can be constructive along the lines that you're asking. Yes?
Can you just elaborate a bit more on your reasoning behind where rights come from a Christian perspective?
I'm not going to elaborate on where I think they come from because I'm not either a theologian or a legal philosopher, and you would quickly see that I'm out of my depth. But I am told by my colleagues who work on these issues that a very strong case can be made that the fundamental rights that we think of today as human rights, and many people think of rights that emerged out of the Enlightenment, in fact, have been embedded in our Christian faith since the very beginning. And in fact, I was just talking to a Christian philosopher the other day, who's also a Christian, and he was saying one of the tricks of the Enlightenment was to kind of take all those rights that had come up and sort of gradually emerged in the previous 15, 16, 1700 years since the time of Christ, strip out all the religion, and then say, aha, look, we've discovered the need for human rights and here they are. And it's a kind of a clever move. Some Christian critics say that actually the notion of human rights detached from Christian theology can't be sustained. That if you really want to make a strong case as to why I should treat you just as well as I treat anybody else in this world, whatever their color or whatever their language, I ultimately have to justify that on religious grounds, on Christian grounds. I can't ultimately justify it on secular grounds. So I think that as Christians we need to reclaim, according to these scholars, the fact that our faith and our heritage has a very, very strong emphasis on rights right from Genesis 1. I'm made in the image of God. And you see it consistently through the Old Testament when the prophets are criticizing Israel. Why are they criticizing? What are they criticizing? Frequently, it's what we would say in contemporary discourse as the abrogation of the rights of widows and of foreigners or immigrants and orphans. So that's all there. We've given it new language, but it actually arises out of our faith. And sometimes we as Christians need to recapture it. Yes?
You were mentioning before the conflict between the interests of an individual and the interests of society. How do you reconcile those two things?
Again, this is not an area where I have a kind of a philosophical ability to be able to respond in the way that it would be helpful. I can just say in observing the people that I've been studying, they try and look for those places where those two things are consonant. So where the interests of defending an individual in a given circumstance coincide with value for society. Now, it may be a person whose values you disagree with entirely, as I think you were suggesting earlier. I think part of the genius of the adversariness that we see in common law and in civil law, fighting for a cause even if you don't believe in it, is that at least it's a check on power. So even if you don't like the cause, even if you're fighting for a value that you don't particularly support, what you are signifying is that this person does not stand alone against a repressive or an authoritarian state or an arbitrary state power. This person has me to defend them. And in that very act, I am demonstrating that there needs to be a check on power in this society. And we Christians get to suffer mightily if there are not those checks and powers the church in China is currently experiencing. So it's not an easy issue to reconcile, but zealous advocacy, which is what many of these lawyers have gotten into trouble for, very zealous advocacy, they feel is integral to their Christian witness to break up power, to defend freedoms given by God against the state that wants to take them away. Yes?
You mentioned earlier about how a lot of the sense of justice and our ideas of human rights stem from our Christian philosophy. How, when arguing that in a more secular environment, or in somewhere where you're attempting to have just a basic discussion with someone who's mightn't be a Christian, mightn't hold that same belief, how valid of a basis for argument, or for an argument or for a discussion do you actually consider that to be? And how would you need to go about justifying those grounds from a secular standpoint?
Yeah, I myself just take it for granted that it's the case. So I don't try and seek to make that argument. But there's a line of writing over the last several decades that tries to substantiate very strongly this point, that these kinds of so-called rights in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, for example, the United Nations in the 1940s, it's no accident that some of the principal architects of those rights were Christians, including an extraordinary Lebanese politician called Charles Malik, very strong Christian, Eleanor Roosevelt. Again, these people are deriving the Universal Declaration for themselves. They're deriving it from their faith, even though they may be justifying it to the world as a whole on other kinds of grounds. And so this is not an argument I get into with others. I say, look, as a Christian, I believe that the rights for which I'm fighting, that I'm talking about here, the rights for which I fight when I'm working with Human Rights Watch or in my criticism of China's current policies, they emerge from my faith. I can show you in the scriptures exactly where I'm deriving these fundamental notions. I myself am not capable of making the philosophical arguments or even the theological arguments at a really sophisticated level.
Right. So would that be
It's not going to bear that's not going to be a very effective defense if you're talking to a philosophy student or to somebody who's working on the history of rights. There you need a more technical kind of knowledge. But there are literatures out there. A legal scholar by the name of Berman, Berman, who's now deceased, wrote a very powerful and brilliant book making this argument very strongly. There's a Christian constitutional lawyer at University of Queensland called Nicholas Aroney, Aroeny, who makes similar kinds of arguments. And so there are plenty of first-rate scholars out there who one can read in order to be able to mount the argument that give one confidence in talking to philosophers or legal theory people and so on. Yes?
What do you think the biggest danger for Australian or Western society today is for our legal, having a good society, like you said, where people are well defended? Is there any big attack what should we be defending, or is there a current danger that's going on? I'll speak for the US, since that's where I spend most of my time. At the moment, with the advent of President Trump, in my view, many US institutions are under tremendous threat. This is a man who has no comprehension of constitutionalism, no comprehension of separation of powers, no comprehension of freedom of speech or protections against populist. But he's only one example of what we're seeing across a number of long-standing liberal political societies in Europe and the UK, and to some degree even in this part of the world. And so I think that as Christians we have to be thinking to ourselves, we have to have our ears attuned to any kinds of attacks on say, the judiciary or the legal system, insofar as it checks majoritarian power. I mean, you can critique the legal system. I critique it. It needs to be done. But critiquing it for checking President Trump's power is not the way to go. We need to be sensitive to any kinds of threats to our civil society, any kinds of ways in which our speech is being restricted, any kinds of ways in which our religious expression is being restricted, any ways in which mobilizing civil society is being restricted, being able to march, being able to protest, being able to do the kinds of things that are crucial. So I think if there's a good thing that is currently happening in the world that seems in decline, in my view, in certain ways, as a Christian thinking about politics, is that we've kind of assumed that all those institutions that we took centuries to construct kind of looked after themselves, and they didn't need maintaining. But what is clear is that these institutions were and are vulnerable. Freedom of the press is now vulnerable in the United States. And so it needs to be defended, and they need to be defended actively, and people need to speak out. And I think Christians need to speak out, not only because we're Christians, because we have a concept of the good society, but ultimately it can also affect us personally in political discourse or in political activities.
Any last questions, guys? No.
Well, thank you all. This has been very stimulating. I appreciate you joining the discussion.
Okay, well, thank you so much for that. Yeah, that was certainly very enlightening. A lot of things I definitely didn't know anything about. Do you have any recommendations for places people could go on the web, or books or anything like that people could look at if they want to find out more about that sort of thing?
It'd be easier for me to email something to you, rather than just give you something off the top of my head.
Yeah.
But I can recommend my own book. One of the things I've tried to do as a Christian in more recent years, I didn't do it earlier, is to actually build
the sort of religious factor, the religious variable into my own research. So I can talk about, some part of what I gave you today about these various doctrines I presented at Harvard Law School a little while back. And it's a way of actually going right into the heart of what you think of as a secular place and say, look, theology matters for real people facing real struggles in real parts of the world. So there's a little part of my book that came out called Criminal Defense in China, came out about 18 months ago, that actually deals with some of these issues. And you can see how real people were dealing with this problem. Or if you Google me on The Guardian, you'll see some op-eds and other things that I've written that talk about the way in which these mostly Christian lawyers have been continuing with the struggle.
Awesome. Okay, thank you so much. Thanks for coming, guys. Next week, please come back. We are going to be in a different room, so don't come here. We're going to be in a building that's going to be on Leicester Street. So if you don't know where that is, it is slightly off campus, heading towards Baiguang Street, I believe. Beck is going to post up another video of how to get there, so if that helped you like it did me, that will be up there as well for next week. Next week's forum is going to be Reverend Dr. Peter Adam. Probably some of you know him already. He's going to be coming and speaking on the topic of, within the Australian context, reconciliation for Indigenous people, but specifically the church's role and responsibilities towards that. So speaking kind of from a Christian perspective on what our attitudes and responsibilities and understandings should be of Australia's colonial history and continual oppression. Yes, so please come along to that. It should be great. There's also going to be, I'm not going to reel them all off for you now, but we do have a good lineup of speakers this semester. Pretty much after week 3, we're going to move to faculty-based forums. So forums are still for everyone to come to, but each faculty is going to have sort of their own special interest topic for those, I think it's week 4 to week 11-ish. So do check in with your faculty as to what topic they've chosen or what speaker they've chosen for you, because then that should be a little bit more specific to some of your interests. Yeah, thanks for coming, guys. Please grab